The morning air was crisp when Margaret stepped off the bus at Riverside Community Center. She clutched a small lunch bag in one hand and smoothed down her faded blue work dress with the other. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun and her shoes were old but polished. She looked like any other woman in her early 50s heading to work, trying to make ends meet. The community center was a large brick building that had seen better days. Paint peeled from the window frames and the sign out front had a burnt-out letter, but inside the place buzzed with life. Children's voices echoed down the hallways and somewhere in the distance, Margaret could hear the faint sound of a piano being played. She reported to the manager's office, where a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Rodriguez handed her a set of keys and a work schedule. "You'll be responsible for cleaning the main hall, the piano rooms, and the offices," she explained, walking Margaret through the building. "We have a music program here for kids who can't afford private lessons. It's struggling, but we're trying to keep it alive." Margaret nodded quietly, taking in every detail. When they passed by one of the practice rooms, she slowed her pace just slightly. Through the small window in the door, she could see a young boy fumbling through a simple melody, his tongue sticking out in concentration. "The music teachers are Mr. Pierce and Miss Foster," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "They're good people, just stressed. Funding is tight, you know how it is." Margaret knew exactly how it was. She'd known for the past 3 years, ever since everything in her life had fallen apart. By mid-morning, she'd already mopped half the main hallway when 2 people came rushing past her, deep in conversation. They didn't even glance her way. Margaret moved her bucket closer to the wall, making herself smaller, more invisible. "I can't believe Catherine just quit like that," the man was saying. He was in his late 30s, wearing a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hair was messy, like he'd been running his hands through it all morning. 3 weeks before the showcase. 3 weeks! Do you know how hard I worked to get those donors to come?" The woman beside him, younger and dressed in a stylish blazer, threw her hands up in frustration. "I told you she was unhappy about the pay. But no, you said we couldn't afford to give her a raise. We can't afford to give anyone a raise. Diana, we can barely afford to keep the lights on." They disappeared into an office and the door slammed shut behind them. Margaret continued mopping, her movements steady and practiced. She'd become good at being invisible over the past few years. It was easier that way. People didn't ask questions when they didn't really see you. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Margaret cleaned the bathrooms, wiped down the windows, and organized the supply closet. During her lunch break, she found a quiet corner in the storage room and unwrapped the sandwich she'd made at home. The room was cluttered with old decorations, broken equipment, and filing boxes. On the wall hung a faded photograph in a dusty frame. It showed the community center on its opening day 30 years ago. There were ribbons, balloons, and well-dressed people smiling for the camera. Margaret looked at the photo for a moment, then turned away and finished her sandwich in silence. In the afternoon, she was assigned to clean the piano practice rooms. There were 3 of them, small spaces with worn carpet and scuffed walls. Each had an upright piano and a few folding chairs. The pianos had seen better days. The keys were yellowed and some of the wood veneer was chipped. But they were still pianos, and Margaret found herself pausing longer than necessary in each room. In the second practice room, a teenage girl was struggling through a Chopin nocturne. Her technique was rough, and she kept hitting wrong notes, but there was something earnest in the way she tried. Margaret pretended to wipe down the windowsill, listening. "Excuse me," the girl said suddenly. "Am I in your way? I can come back later." No, Margaret said quickly, her voice soft. "You keep practicing. I'm almost done." The girl smiled and returned to her music. Margaret finished cleaning and quietly slipped out. By the time the afternoon practice sessions began, the hallways were filled with the overlapping sounds of multiple students playing different pieces. It created a strange, chaotic symphony. Margaret found it beautiful in its own way. All those young people trying their best, making mistakes, trying again. She was emptying a trash bin near the main piano room when she heard Mr. Pierce and Miss Foster arguing again. Their voices carried through the thin walls. "We need 8 performances for the showcase," Mr. Pierce was saying. "Catherine was supposed to do a duet with Amy. Now we only have 7. Can't one of the students do 2 pieces?" Miss Foster suggested. "They're already stretched thin. And the donors are expecting a full program. If we look unprepared, we can kiss that grant money goodbye." Margaret pushed her cleaning cart past the door, not wanting to eavesdrop. But their stress was palpable. She understood the pressure they were under, even if they didn't know she understood. As the day wore on, Margaret settled into the rhythm of her work. She scrubbed floors, dusted shelves, and took out the trash. Other staff members passed by her without really seeing her. The teachers were too busy with their students. The administrative staff were buried in paperwork. To everyone at the Riverside Community Center, Margaret was just the new custodian. A quiet, middle-aged woman doing a thankless job for minimum wage. And that was exactly how Margaret wanted it. When her shift ended at 5 o'clock, she changed out of her work dress in the staff bathroom and caught the bus back to her small apartment across town. She lived on the 3rd floor of an old building, in a 1-bedroom unit with creaky floors and a window that overlooked a parking lot. The rent was cheap, and that was all that mattered. Inside her apartment, there was very little furniture. A second-hand couch, a small TV, a kitchen table with 1 chair. But in the corner of the living room, covered with a sheet, was an old upright piano. Margaret looked at it every day when she came home, but she never uncovered it. She hadn't touched those keys in 3 years. That night, she made herself a simple dinner and watched the news. Before bed, she ironed her work dress for the next day and packed another modest lunch. Her life had become small and predictable, and that was how she'd survived. No surprises, no attention, no memories flooding back to drown her. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she could hear her neighbor's TV through the thin walls. Somewhere in the building, a baby was crying. These were the sounds of her life now. Simple, anonymous, safe. She didn't let herself think about the sound of an orchestra warming up, or the weight of a full concert hall's attention, or the way her fingers used to fly across keys in front of thousands of people. Those memories belonged to someone else, someone who no longer existed. Margaret closed her eyes and waited for sleep to come, just as she did every night. Tomorrow would be another day of mopping floors and emptying trash bins, another day of being invisible, and for now that was enough. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret started working at the Riverside Community Center, and she'd fallen into a comfortable routine. She arrived early, worked quietly, and left on time. The other staff members had stopped noticing her completely, which was exactly what she wanted. She was just part of the building now, like the water fountains or the bulletin boards. It was a Monday morning when everything changed. Margaret arrived to find the parking lot filled with emergency vehicles, a plumbing truck, a water damage restoration van, and Mrs. Rodriguez standing outside with her phone pressed to her ear, looking absolutely devastated. "What happened?" Margaret asked one of the other maintenance workers. "Water pipe burst over the weekend," he explained, shaking his head. "Right in the main piano room. Flooded the whole space. 3 of the keyboards are ruined, and the room's not safe to use until they fix the ceiling." Margaret's heart sank. She thought of those students practicing so hard for their showcase. She thought of the young girl playing Chopin and the little boy with his tongue sticking out in concentration. Inside, the building was in chaos. Staff members were hauling damaged equipment out of the flooded room. The carpet squelched under their feet, and the smell of mildew was already starting to set in. Mr. Pierce stood in the doorway, his face pale, staring at the destruction. 2 weeks, he kept saying to himself. The showcase is in 2 weeks. Miss Foster was on her phone, frantically calling parents to let them know they'd have to relocate practice sessions. Her voice was strained, and Margaret could see her hands shaking. The next few days were a blur of activity. The community center scrambled to move the music program to whatever spaces they could find. Some students practiced in the main hall. Others were moved to a church down the street that offered to let them use their space. The schedule was a mess, and everyone was stressed. Margaret continued her work, cleaning up the water damage and helping wherever she could. She stayed late most nights, not because she had to, but because she couldn't bear to leave while everyone else was working so hard to save the program. It was Thursday afternoon, exactly 10 days before the showcase, when disaster struck again. Margaret was mopping the relocated practice area in the main hall when she heard Mr. Pierce let out a sound of pure frustration. He was sitting at a folding table, surrounded by papers, his head in his hands. "What's wrong now?" Miss Foster asked, walking over with 2 cups of coffee. "Amy Henderson's family is moving. They're leaving this weekend. She has to drop out of the showcase." Miss Foster set the coffee down slowly. Amy was doing the duet with Catherine, but Catherine already quit. "I know. So now we're down 2 performances." "I know." Mr. Pierce looked up. and Margaret could see exhaustion written all over his face. We needed 8 performances to fill the program. Now we only have 6. The donors are expecting a full showcase. If we can't deliver, they're not going to fund us. And if they don't fund us, the program dies. Margaret felt something twist in her chest. She turned back to her mop, trying to focus on her work, but she couldn't stop listening. Can we combine some pieces? Make them longer? Miss Foster suggested. These kids are already playing pieces at the edge of their ability. We can't ask them to do more. They sat in silence for a moment. Margaret could hear the clock on the wall ticking. What if we ask one of the parents to perform? Miss Foster tried again. We already did. Nobody wants to. They're all too nervous. Margaret kept mopping, making slow circles on the floor. Her cart was right near their table, but they didn't seem to notice she was there. She was invisible again, just part of the background. Then Mr. Pierce's eyes landed on her. Margaret? She looked up, startled. He was staring at her like he was really seeing her for the first time. Do you play piano at all? Margaret's grip tightened on her mop handle. Her heart started beating faster. A little bit. Could you play something, anything? We just need to fill 2 spots in the program. His voice was desperate now, almost pleading. It doesn't have to be complicated. Just something simple, please. Miss Foster looked doubtful. She glanced at Margaret's worn dress, her calloused hands, her simple appearance. Jonathan, we don't have any other options, he interrupted. Margaret, would you be willing to help us out? Just 2 simple pieces. We could put you early in the program, get it over with quick. You wouldn't have to do anything fancy. Margaret felt trapped. Every instinct told her to say no, to refuse, to keep herself hidden. But when she looked at Mr. Pierce's exhausted face and thought about those kids who'd worked so hard, something in her couldn't say no. Okay, she said quietly. I'll do it. The relief on Mr. Pierce's face was immediate. Thank you. Thank you so much. You have no idea how much this helps. Miss Foster still looked skeptical, but she managed a tight smile. That's very kind of you, Margaret. They went back to their planning, already moving on to the next crisis. Margaret finished mopping and pushed her cart down the hallway, her hands trembling slightly. What had she just agreed to? That night she lay awake in her apartment, staring at the sheet-covered piano in the corner. She'd been so careful for 3 years, so careful to stay hidden, to avoid anything that might remind her of who she used to be, and now she'd volunteered to play piano in front of an audience. But it was just 2 simple pieces, she told herself. She could play something basic, something a beginner might know. She'd get through it, help the program, and then fade back into invisibility. Nobody had to know anything. The next few days passed in a strange haze. Margaret continued her work, but she felt increasingly anxious. She caught herself pausing outside practice rooms more often, listening to the students play. Her fingers would twitch slightly, muscle memory trying to surface after years of being suppressed. On Tuesday, exactly 1 week before the showcase, Mr. Pierce found her during her lunch break. Margaret, I realized I never actually heard you play, he said, looking embarrassed. Would you mind showing me what you're planning to perform? I just want to make sure we have the right music and that you're comfortable with everything. Margaret's sandwich suddenly felt like lead in her stomach. I'm not sure I'm ready yet. It doesn't have to be perfect, he assured her. I just need to hear something so I can plan the program properly. Can you come to the practice room after your shift today? She couldn't think of a good reason to refuse. Okay, great. Say 5:30? Miss Foster will be there too. We'll keep it quick, I promise. The rest of the day crawled by. Margaret cleaned with mechanical efficiency, her mind elsewhere. She kept thinking about the piano in her apartment, still covered, still silent. She thought about the last time she'd played in public, before everything had fallen apart. She thought about the person she used to be. At 5:30, she walked slowly to the practice room. Her palms were sweating. Through the door's window, she could see Mr. Pierce and Miss Foster waiting, chatting casually. They looked relaxed, expecting nothing more than a clumsy rendition of some children's song. Margaret took a deep breath and opened the door. There she is, Mr. Pierce said cheerfully. Come on in, Margaret. Don't be nervous. We're just going to have you play a bit so we can figure out the program order. The piano in the room was one of the better ones, an older model that had been well maintained. Margaret approached it like it might bite her. She sat on the bench and her hands hovered over the keys. The feel of them under her fingers, even without pressing down, sent a jolt through her entire body. It had been 3 years since she'd touched a piano. 3 years of silence. 3 years of hiding. "Whenever you're ready," Mr. Pierce said encouragingly. "What were you thinking of playing?" Margaret's mouth went dry. She should say something simple. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," or "Mary Had a Little Lamb." Something that matched what they expected from her. But instead, different words came out. "I was thinking." Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. The room went completely silent. Then Miss Foster laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, but the kind of laugh that escapes when someone says something absurd. "Margaret, that's one of the hardest pieces in classical music. Even professional concert pianists struggle with it." Mr. Pierce looked uncomfortable. "Margaret, that's really ambitious, but maybe we should think about something more manageable. Have you ever heard that piece played?" "I've heard it," Margaret said quietly. "It's incredibly difficult," Miss Foster added, her tone now slightly condescending. "It takes years of advanced training. Decades, even. No offense, but I think we need to be realistic here." Margaret felt her face flush hot. She started to speak to explain, but Mr. Pierce cut her off gently. "Look, how about this? Why don't we start with something simpler? Do you know Für Elise? Just the first section? That would be perfect for the showcase. Simple, recognizable, and definitely within reach." "But I can." Margaret tried again. "We really appreciate your enthusiasm," Mr. Pierce continued, his voice kind but firm. "But we need performances that will actually work. Tell you what, let's schedule a practice session tomorrow. I'll teach you Für Elise myself. It's easier than you think once someone shows you the pattern." Miss Foster nodded in agreement. "That's a much better idea. Something appropriate." Margaret sat at the piano, her hands now resting in her lap. They were treating her like a child. No, worse than that. They were treating her like someone who didn't know the difference between dreaming and reality. "Tomorrow at 5:30? Mr. Pierce asked. "I'll bring the sheet music and we'll work through it together." Margaret nodded numbly. She stood up from the piano bench without having played a single note. The night after the disastrous piano room encounter, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the scene in her mind. Miss Foster's laugh, Mr. Pierce's condescending kindness, the way they'd looked at her, like she was a confused child who didn't understand her own limitations. She got out of bed around midnight and walked to the corner of her living room. The sheet covering her piano seemed to glow in the darkness. Slowly, she reached out and pulled it away. The piano underneath was beautiful, even in the dim light. It was a professional instrument, the kind that cost more than most people's cars. The wood gleamed even after 3 years of being covered. Margaret ran her finger along the keys without pressing them down. She remembered the day she'd bought this piano. She'd been 26 years old, performing in concert halls across 3 continents. The world had been hers. And then, so quickly, it had all been taken away. Margaret covered the piano again and went back to bed. But sleep never came. The next day at work, she moved through her tasks like a ghost. She mopped floors without seeing them. She emptied trash bins mechanically. Other staff members noticed she seemed distracted, but nobody asked if she was okay. Nobody really knew her well enough to ask. At 5:30, she walked to the practice room with heavy feet. Through the window, she could see Mr. Pierce already there, sheet music spread across the piano. He waved when he saw her, smiling encouragingly. "Ready for your lesson?" he asked as she entered. Lesson. The word made something bitter rise in Margaret's throat, but she swallowed it down and nodded. "Great. So, Für Elise is actually one of the most popular pieces for beginners," Mr. Pierce began, sitting on the bench and patting the space beside him. "It sounds complicated, but once you break it down, it's really just patterns." Margaret sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "Now let me show you where middle C is," he continued, pressing the key. The single note rang out in the small room. "This is your anchor point. Everything relates back to this note. Do you understand?" "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "Good. Now the piece starts with this pattern." He played the famous opening notes slowly, one at a time. E D sharp, E D sharp, E B D C, see? Just 8 notes. Let's try it together. He guided her hand to the keys like she'd never touched a piano before. Margaret's fingers landed on the correct notes by pure instinct, but she played them hesitantly, pretending to struggle slightly. "Not bad," Mr. Pierce said. "You've got the notes right, but let's work on the rhythm. It should flow more smoothly." Watch me again." Just then, Miss Foster entered the room carrying a cup of coffee. "How's the lesson going?" "She's getting it," Mr. Pierce said. "Margaret's a quick learner." Miss Foster leaned against the wall, watching with barely concealed amusement. Margaret felt her cheeks burn. This was humiliating. She was being taught a beginner's piece like she was a child, while Miss Foster watched like it was entertainment. "Let's try the next phrase," Mr. Pierce continued, oblivious to Margaret's discomfort. "Now this part is a little trickier. You're going to use your thumb here and your middle finger here." He went on explaining basic hand positions, fingering techniques, and how to read simple notation. Margaret wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them that she'd performed this piece when she was 7 years old, that she'd played it in Carnegie Hall as an encore after a 2-hour recital, that she could play it backwards in the dark with her eyes closed, but she said nothing. She just nodded and followed his instructions, playing like a struggling beginner. "I think that's enough for today," Mr. Pierce finally said after 45 minutes. "You're doing really well. Keep practicing this first section and we'll add more tomorrow. The showcase is in 6 days, so we need to make sure you're comfortable." 6 days should be plenty of time for just this section, Miss Foster added. "Don't push yourself too hard, Margaret. Simple is perfectly fine." After they left, Margaret sat alone at the piano. Her hands shook with frustration. She pressed down on the keys, playing the opening of Für Elise at full tempo, with all the expression and nuance it deserved. The piece flowed from her fingers like water, then she stopped abruptly and stood up. What was she doing? This was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid. She needed to play simple, be invisible, get through the showcase, and return to her quiet life. The next 3 days followed the same pattern. Margaret would work during the day, then meet Mr. Pierce for a lesson in the evening. Each session was torture. He taught her basic concepts that she'd mastered before she was 10 years old. He praised her for simple achievements like a teacher praising a kindergartner for learning their colors. Miss Foster often sat in on these sessions, sometimes offering her own condescending advice. "Remember to keep your wrists loose, Margaret. That's very important." Or, "Don't be discouraged if it sounds rough. You're doing great for someone who's just learning." Margaret endured it all in silence. She played badly on purpose, making small mistakes, asking basic questions. She became exactly what they expected her to be, a well-meaning amateur who'd bitten off more than she could chew. But at night, alone in her apartment, Margaret would stand by her covered piano and feel something building inside her. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was something else, something that had been dormant for 3 years, slowly waking up. On Thursday, 2 days before the showcase, Mr. Pierce seemed particularly anxious during their lesson. "I'm a little worried about the timing," he confessed. "The section you're playing is taking about 2 minutes. We need it to be at least 3 minutes to properly fill your slot in the program." "I could play more of the piece," Margaret suggested quietly. No, he said quickly. "You're barely comfortable with this section. Let's not add pressure. What if you just played it slower, really drew out each note? That would add time and make it more dramatic." Margaret stared at him. He was asking her to play one of the most beloved pieces in classical music at half speed to fill time. It would sound ridiculous. It would be a mockery of the music. "That's a great idea," Miss Foster chimed in from her spot by the door. "And slower will be easier for you anyway. Less chance of mistakes." "I really think I could play more," Margaret tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Pierce patted her shoulder. "Margaret, I appreciate your confidence, but let's be realistic. You've been learning piano for what, less than 2 weeks? What you've accomplished already is impressive. Don't push too hard. 2 weeks." They thought she'd been learning piano for 2 weeks. Margaret wanted to laugh. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream that she'd forgotten more about music than either of them would ever know, but instead she just nodded and played the piece slowly, mechanically, letting each note drag on like a dying breath. "Perfect," Mr. Pierce declared. "See? You're going to do great." That night, Margaret didn't go straight home. Instead, she walked around the city for hours, her mind churning. The streets were mostly empty, just a few late-night workers and people heading home from bars. She walked past the concert hall where she'd performed 20 years ago, before she'd made it big when she was still building her career. The building was dark now, locked up for the night. But Margaret stood outside for a long time, remembering. She remembered the weight of a full audience's attention, the feeling of her fingers flying across keys, the way music could transport you to another world entirely. She'd given that up. After her husband died and the debts piled up, after she'd lost everything, she'd convinced herself that she needed to disappear. That Margaret Chen, the pianist, had died along with her old life. And what was left was just this. A woman in a worn dress mopping floors, invisible to everyone around her. But standing outside that concert hall, something shifted inside her. She thought about those two teachers, so certain they knew what she was capable of. So sure that she was just a simple custodian with delusions of grandeur. Margaret turned and walked home. When she got to her apartment, she went straight to the piano and pulled off the sheet completely. She sat down at the bench and placed her hands on the keys. She didn't play for Elise. She didn't play anything simple or safe. Instead, her fingers found the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, the piece that Mr. Pierce and Miss Foster had laughed at. The piece they'd said was impossible for someone like her. The music poured out of her like a dam breaking. Her hands remembered everything, the impossible stretches, the rapid-fire passages that made other pianists weep, the delicate moments that required absolute control. She played the most technically demanding sections, the parts that separated amateurs from professionals, the passages that had made this piece legendary in its difficulty. She played for over an hour, working through muscle memory, rebuilding connections that had been severed for 3 years. Her fingers ached, her back hurt from the posture, but it felt like coming home. When she finally stopped, the sun was starting to rise. Margaret sat at the piano, breathing hard, her cheeks wet with tears she didn't remember crying. Tomorrow was Friday. The showcase was Saturday night. In less than 48 hours, she would stand on a stage in front of donors, parents, and press. They would expect her to play a slow, clumsy version of Für Elise. They would expect nothing from her except to not embarrass herself too badly. Margaret looked at her hands. They were the hands of a custodian now, rough from cleaning, calloused from hard work. But they were also the hands of a concert pianist, trained since childhood, capable of things that most people couldn't imagine. She thought about staying safe, about playing the simple piece, getting through the showcase without making waves, returning to her invisible life. Then she thought about those two teachers, their condescending smiles, their absolute certainty that they knew who she was and what she could do. Margaret stood up from the piano bench. She went to her closet and pulled out a dress she hadn't worn in 3 years. It was simple but elegant, the kind of thing she used to wear to performances. She held it up to the window, letting the early morning light shine through the fabric. For 3 years, she'd been running from her past, hiding from who she used to be. Maybe it was time to stop running. The showcase was in 2 days. Margaret had a decision to make. Friday morning arrived with heavy clouds that threatened rain. Margaret woke up on her couch, still in yesterday's clothes. The piano stood uncovered in the corner, and sheet music was scattered across the floor. She'd finally fallen asleep around 7 in the morning after hours of playing. Her fingers ached as she made coffee. It was a good ache, the kind she remembered from her performing days when she'd practiced for 8 hours straight. Her body was remembering what it meant to really play. At work, Margaret moved through her morning tasks in a daze. She couldn't stop thinking about tomorrow night, the showcase, the moment of decision that was rushing toward her like a freight train. "You okay, Margaret?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, catching her staring blankly at a mop bucket. "You look tired." "I'm fine," Margaret said quickly. "Just didn't sleep well." "Well, don't wear yourself out. Big day tomorrow with the showcase. Are you nervous about your performance?" Margaret managed a small smile. "Something like that." Around lunchtime, she saw Mr. Pierce and Miss Foster setting up the main hall for tomorrow's event. They were arranging chairs, testing the sound system, putting up decorations. The energy in the building was electric. Students kept running by, excited and nervous. Parents arrived to drop off performance outfits and offer last-minute encouragement. Margaret ate her sandwich in her usual spot in the storage room, but she couldn't taste it. Her mind was somewhere else entirely. She kept going back and forth, changing her decision every few minutes. Play it safe. No, be honest. Hide. No, reveal yourself. The argument in her head was exhausting. She was throwing away her lunch wrapper when she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Margaret?" She turned to find Roberto, one of the younger students. He was maybe 10 years old with gap-toothed smile and nervous energy. He'd be performing a simple Mozart piece tomorrow. "Hi, Roberto. Shouldn't you be in school?" "Half day today," he explained. "Miss Margaret, I heard you're playing tomorrow too. Are you scared?" The question was so direct, so innocent that Margaret couldn't help but smile. "A little bit. Are you?" "Really scared," he admitted. "My mom says it's okay to be scared. She says brave people get scared too, but they do the thing anyway." "Your mom sounds very wise." Roberto nodded seriously. "Mr. Pierce said you're playing for Elise. That's a pretty song. My sister learned it last year. She messed up during her recital, but everyone still clapped." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. Did that make her feel better? That everyone clapped anyway? Roberto thought about it. I think she wished she'd played it right. But Mr. Pierce told her that messing up is part of learning. He says music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. Being honest, Margaret repeated quietly. Yeah, like playing the music the way you really feel it, not just the way you think you should. Roberto shrugged. I don't really get it, but it sounded nice. Before Margaret could respond, Roberto's mother called him from down the hall. He waved goodbye and ran off, leaving Margaret standing alone in the storage room, being honest. Not perfect, but honest. Margaret looked up at the old photograph on the wall. The one from the community center's opening 30 years ago. She'd avoided really looking at it before, but now she stepped closer. There, in the center of the photo, was a younger version of herself. She was maybe 25, wearing an elegant dress, standing next to the mayor. The caption below read, "Community Center opens with performance by renowned pianist Margaret Chen." She'd forgotten about this performance. It was during her rising career when she was starting to make a name for herself. She'd played for free that day, wanting to give back to the community that had supported her early training. The memory came flooding back. The way the audience had gasped during certain passages, the standing ovation, the feeling of using her gift to bring joy to people who couldn't normally afford concert tickets. That was who she'd been. Someone who played honestly, with everything she had. Margaret touched the glass over the photograph, then walked out of the storage room. The afternoon crawled by. Margaret cleaned mechanically, her mind far away. She kept catching herself pausing outside the main hall, watching the setup progress. The stage looked small but professional. There was a spotlight, a good sound system, and enough chairs for about 200 people. At 5 o'clock, as her shift was ending, Mr. Pierce found her. "Margaret, there you are. I wanted to check in one last time before tomorrow. Are you feeling good about your piece?" Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. He was a good person, she realized. Stressed and overworked, maybe a bit condescending, but ultimately someone who cared deeply about these kids and this program. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He simply didn't know any better. "Mr. Pierce," she said slowly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you become a music teacher?" He seemed surprised by the question. "Why? Well, Music changed my life when I was young. I wasn't a great player, but I loved it. And I wanted to give that gift to other people, especially kids who might not otherwise have the chance." Margaret nodded. "That's a good reason. Are you worried about tomorrow?" he asked gently. "It's okay if you are. Everyone gets nervous before performing." "I'm not worried," Margaret said, and she realized it was true. For the first time in days, she felt calm, clear. "I know exactly what I'm going to do." "That's great. I'm proud of you for stepping up like this. It really saved the program." After he left, Margaret changed out of her work clothes and caught the bus home. But instead of going to her apartment, she rode past her stop and got off downtown. She walked to a small music store she'd passed many times but never entered. The bell jingled as she pushed open the door. The shop smelled like old wood and sheet music. An elderly man behind the counter looked up from a repair he was working on. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I need sheet music," Margaret said. "Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, the full score." The man's eyebrows went up. "That's quite a piece. Are you performing it?" "Tomorrow night." He studied her for a moment, and Margaret wondered what he saw. A middle-aged woman in worn clothes asking for one of the most difficult pieces in classical music. But whatever he thought, he didn't say it. He just nodded and went to his shelves. "I have it here," he said, pulling down a thick book. "This is the best edition. Good fingering suggestions, clear notation. Though if you're performing tomorrow, I imagine you already know it pretty well." "I used to," Margaret said quietly. "I'm remembering." The man rang up her purchase, and as he handed her the music, he said, "Good luck tomorrow." "That's a brave choice." "Or a stupid one," Margaret said with a small smile. "Sometimes those are the same thing." Back at her apartment, Margaret made a simple dinner and then sat at her piano with the new sheet music. She didn't need it to play the piece. Her fingers remembered it all, but having it there felt right. It felt like she was taking this seriously, treating herself like the professional she'd once been. She played through the entire first movement, then the second, then the famous third with its devastating difficulty. Her neighbors probably wondered what was happening. For 3 years, this apartment had been silent. Now powerful music poured through the thin walls. Around 11 o'clock, there was a knock at her door. Margaret stopped playing, her heart racing. Had someone complained? But when she opened the door, it was her neighbor from across the hall. An elderly man named George who mostly kept to himself. "I'm sorry," Margaret said immediately. "I know it's late. I should have been quieter." George held up a hand. "I'm not here to complain. I wanted to tell you that was beautiful. I haven't heard anything like that in years. My late wife used to play piano, though nothing as complicated as what you're playing." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. Are you performing somewhere?" "Tomorrow night. At the Riverside Community Center." George smiled. "I might just have to come see that. Good night, miss. And don't stop playing on my account. At my age, I don't sleep much anyway." After he left, Margaret stood in her doorway for a long moment. Then she went back to her piano and played until 2 in the morning. When she finally went to bed, she set the alarm for 8. The showcase wasn't until 7 tomorrow night, but she wanted time to prepare. To be ready? She lay in the darkness, listening to the city sounds outside her window. Somewhere in the building, a baby was crying. A siren wailed in the distance. These were the sounds of real life, messy and imperfect. Margaret thought about tomorrow. About walking onto that stage in front of Mr. Pierce and Miss Foster, in front of the donors and parents and students. About sitting at the piano while they all expected her to play a slow, clumsy version of Fur Elise. And then about playing something else entirely. She would lose her invisibility. People would ask questions. They would want to know her story, why she'd been hiding, what had happened to her. The simple, safe life she'd built would be shattered. But maybe, Margaret thought as she finally drifted off to sleep, maybe some things were worth breaking out of hiding for. Maybe being honest mattered more than being safe. Tomorrow night she would find out. Her last thought before sleep took her was of Roberto's words. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. And then finally, she slept peacefully for the first time in 3 years. Saturday morning came with clear skies and bright sunshine, as if the universe was making up for the week's earlier gloom. Margaret woke before her alarm, feeling strangely calm. She made coffee, ate a simple breakfast, and spent an hour at her piano, not practicing so much as communing with it. Her fingers moved through familiar passages while her mind stayed quiet and clear. Around noon, she took a long shower and began preparing. She pulled out the dress she'd looked at yesterday. It was navy blue, simple but elegant, with 3/4 sleeves. She'd bought it for a performance 6 years ago, back when her life was different. It still fit, though it hung a bit looser now. Margaret did her hair carefully, pulling it up in a style she used to wear for concerts. She put on minimal makeup, just enough to look polished under stage lights. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw someone she'd almost forgotten. Not the famous pianist she'd been, but not the invisible custodian either. Someone in between, someone real. She arrived at the Riverside Community Center at 4 o'clock, 3 hours before the showcase. The building was buzzing with activity. Students ran through last-minute practice sessions. Parents fussed with their children's outfits. Mr. Pierce and Miss Foster were everywhere at once, checking lists, testing equipment, managing small crises. Margaret slipped in through the side entrance, hoping to avoid attention. She wanted to wait in her usual storage room until it was time, but as she walked down the hallway, Mrs. Rodriguez spotted her. "Margaret, is that you?" She did a double take. "Oh my goodness, you look lovely. I didn't realize you cleaned up so nice." "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. "Are you nervous about tonight?" "Not nervous," Margaret said. "Just ready." She spent the next 2 hours in her storage room, sitting on an overturned crate, breathing slowly. Through the walls, she could hear the building filling up. Voices, laughter, the squeak of chairs being adjusted. At 6:30, she heard the sound check happening on stage. A microphone test. Someone playing a few notes on the piano to warm it up. That piano. Margaret had cleaned around it dozens of times. It was a decent instrument, an older model but well maintained. Not a concert grand, but it would do. It would more than do. At 6:45 there was a knock on the storage room door. Mr. Pierce stuck his head in. Margaret, there you are. We're starting in 15 minutes. You're third in the program right after little Roberto. He paused, really looking at her for the first time. Wow, you look different. Just wanted to look presentable, Margaret said. You'll do great. Remember, nice and slow on Fur-Elise, and if you mess up, just keep going. Everyone's here to support you. He gave her an encouraging smile and disappeared. Margaret stood up and smoothed her dress. She walked to the hallway that led backstage. From there, she could peek out at the audience through a gap in the curtain. The main hall was packed. Every seat was filled and people stood along the walls. She recognized some faces. Parents she'd seen picking up their kids. Mrs. Rodriguez in the third row. And there in the front row were the donors. Well-dressed people with serious expressions, the ones who held the program's future in their hands. Miss Foster stood to the side of the stage with a clipboard, managing the order of performers. The students waited nervously in a small backstage area, some running through fingering exercises in the air, others breathing deeply to calm their nerves. At exactly 7 o'clock, Mr. Pierce walked onto the stage. The crowd quieted. Good evening, everyone, he began, his voice warm. Thank you so much for coming to our annual showcase. Tonight, you'll see the incredible talent we're nurturing here at the Riverside Community Center. These students have worked so hard, and I'm proud of every single one of them. He talked about the program, its history, its importance to the community. He mentioned the recent challenges, the water damage, the need for continued support. The donors nodded along, taking notes. And now, Mr. Pierce concluded, let's welcome our first performer, young Ana Rodriguez, who will be playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. First movement. A 12-year-old girl walked onto the stage looking terrified. But when she sat at the piano and began to play, her fear melted away. The piece wasn't perfect. She hit a few wrong notes and her timing wavered in places. But she played with heart, and when she finished, the audience erupted in warm applause. One by one, the students performed. Each brought their own style, their own strengths and weaknesses. The audience clapped enthusiastically after each piece, and Margaret could see the donors smiling, leaning toward each other and whispering approvingly. Then it was Roberto's turn. He walked onto the stage with his gap-toothed grin, waved at his mom in the audience, and sat at the piano. He played his Mozart piece with infectious joy, bouncing slightly on the bench. When he finished, he took a dramatic bow that made everyone laugh and cheer. As Roberto ran off stage, Miss Foster looked at her clipboard, then at Margaret. You're up, she whispered. Remember, you're just filling time. Keep it simple. You've got this. Margaret stepped toward the stage entrance. Her heart was pounding now, but not with fear. With something else. Something that felt like coming alive after a long sleep. Mr. Pierce was at the microphone again. Our next performer is someone very special. She only recently joined our community center family, but she volunteered to help us out when we needed an extra performance. Please welcome Margaret Chen. Margaret walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, just like she remembered. The audience was a sea of faces, some curious, some polite, some clearly wondering what the custodian was doing up there in a nice dress. She could see Mr. Pierce and Miss Foster in the wings, giving her encouraging thumbs up. They expected this to be awkward. A kind gesture from a well-meaning amateur, something to smile about later. Margaret sat at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their familiar weight. The audience settled into expectant silence, and then, instead of the opening notes of Fur-Elise, Margaret's hand struck the powerful, commanding opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. The effect was immediate and electric. The audience gasped. In the wings, Mr. Pierce's mouth fell open. Miss Foster actually dropped her clipboard. But Margaret didn't see any of this. Her eyes were closed, and she was somewhere else entirely. She was in the music, in the spaces between notes, in the thundering passages and delicate moments. Her fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. The difficult passages that made professional pianists weep poured out of her like breathing. This wasn't someone who'd been learning piano for 2 weeks. This wasn't someone playing above her skill level. This was a master at work, playing one of the most demanding pieces in the classical repertoire with absolute authority. The first section built to a powerful climax, then softened into the beautiful lyrical passage that follows. Margaret poured 3 years of silence, grief, and suppression into every note. She played her husband's death, her financial collapse, her choice to disappear. She played her loneliness and her fear and her hope. And then she played her decision to come back. To be honest, to stop hiding. The technical sections were flawless. Her hands stretched impossibly across the keys, hitting every note with perfect clarity, even at breakneck speed. The crowd sat in stunned silence, barely breathing. Some people had tears streaming down their faces. Others sat with their mouths open, unable to believe what they were hearing. In the front row, the donors were leaning forward in their seats, completely transfixed. This was not what they'd expected from a small community center showcase. Margaret played the famous third movement section, the part that had ended careers when pianists couldn't master it. Her hands moved like they had their own intelligence, like they were separate beings entirely devoted to creating beauty. The difficult octave runs, the impossible jumps, the sections where both hands had to play complex rhythms independently, while somehow still creating a unified whole. She made it all look easy. Not because it was easy, but because she was that good. The final section built and built, climbing toward the stunning conclusion. Margaret's whole body moved with the music. Sweat dampened her hairline. Her breathing came hard. But her hands never faltered, never missed a note. And then, with a final powerful chord sequence, it was over. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret sat at the piano, breathing hard, her hands still on the keys. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the audience exploded. People leaped to their feet. The applause was deafening. Someone shouted, "Brava!" Several people were openly crying. The donors in the front row stood with everyone else, clapping furiously. Roberto was jumping up and down in the wings, his face lit up with joy. Margaret stood slowly and took a small bow. The applause continued, wave after wave of it. She looked out at the faces and saw shock, joy, amazement, and wonder. Mr. Pierce stood frozen in the wings, his face pale. Miss Foster had her hands over her mouth, tears running down her cheeks. Margaret gave one more bow and walked off stage. The applause followed her, not stopping, the audience demanding more. But Margaret kept walking. She walked past Mr. Pierce, who tried to speak but couldn't find words. She walked past Miss Foster, who was shaking her head in disbelief. She walked down the hallway, out the side door, and into the cool evening air. She stood in the parking lot, breathing deeply, her whole body shaking with released emotion. It was done. She'd done it. She'd stopped hiding. Behind her, she heard the door open. She turned to find Mr. Pierce and Miss Foster standing there, along with several of the donors and Mrs. Rodriguez. "Margaret," Mr. Pierce finally managed. That was impossible," Miss Foster finished. "That was impossible. Who are you?" Margaret looked at them all, at their confused, amazed faces, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. She felt like herself. "My name is Margaret Chen," she said quietly. "I was a concert pianist.